Fascism is not born solely from the desire and subsidies of capitalist magnates. Siloni correctly observes, quote, "To declare that these organisations are only a diabolic invention of finance capital wishing to preserve its rule is not enough for an understanding of the nature of these forces which rise from the depths of society." End quote. Doubtless in the beginning, when they are still playing merely the role of anti-labour militia, the fascist bands recruit many adventurers with the mentality of mercenaries. But as fascism orientates itself towards the conquest of power and becomes a great mass movement, the motives that bring thousands of human beings to it become more complex and require painstaking analysis. The capitalist magnates could never, in spite of all their gold, have set marching such human forces if the masses had not previously been in a state of instability and discontent that conditioned them for conquest. As a matter of fact, in Italy as in Germany, the various social layers intermediate between big capitalist bourgeoisie and organised proletariat, who were victims of both the developments and the crisis of capitalism, were profoundly discontented with their condition, material as well as moral. They dreamed of a radical change. At once the question arises, why did they not turn to socialism? This is what we are going to try to explain. Let us first consider the urban middle classes. The backbone of the fascist troops was the urban middle classes. Socialism long believed that these middle classes were doomed to disappear as a result of capitalist development itself. Competition and the concentration of industry and capital would destroy their economic roots. Quote, "The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers and retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and peasants." End quote. The Communist Manifesto of 1848 declared, quote, "All these sink gradually into the proletariat. They even see the moment approaching when they will completely disappear as an independent section of modern society." End quote. In actuality, that development has been somewhat different, or at least much less rapid than socialism had expected. The middle classes have, it is true, suffered from competition and capitalist concentration. Their condition has grown worse. They have been impoverished, but they have not disappeared. The individuals making up the class have not all sunk into the proletariat. They have not been proletarianised, but only pauperised. They stubbornly persist even today in attempting to constitute an independent section of modern society. The more they suffer, the more they cling to their existence as a class. Toward the end of the last century, Edward Bernstein noted that the small manufacturers, artisans and tradesmen succeeded in maintaining themselves and even increasing their numbers, absolutely if not relatively. This does not mean, of course, that capitalist concentration is slowing down. The big enterprises are expanding more rapidly than the little producers or small tradesmen are increasing. The latter find the competition of the great monopolies ever harsher, but they continue to exist. Why this resistance? Because the independent producer prefers his condition, even though it becomes more precarious every day, to that of the proletariat, just as, for the same reason, proletarians continually escape from their own class and come to join the ranks of the middle classes. The course of evolution predicted has been checked by still another factor. At a certain stage of its development, capitalism itself engenders middle classes of a new kind. Their characteristic, in comparison with older ones, is economic dependence. Unlike the independent middle class, the newcomers no longer control the greater part of their instruments of production. If they are not, properly speaking, wage earners, they live from salaries, fees or commissions. Kautsky was the first to draw attention to them. He showed how the heads of modern enterprises delegate a part of their functions to appointed workers, engineers, designers, technicians, doctors, lawyers, attached to the company. Furthermore, the great industrial combinations organise their own commercial outlets. They set up an army of distributors, agents, garage managers, repairmen, etc. The small artisan and little tradesman can survive only by renouncing their independence and indirectly becoming wage earners. The small retailer becomes a branch manager for a chain store. The craftsman is reduced to the role of skilled worker, etc. Although they have no economic independence, the individuals composing the new middle classes have by no means sunk into the proletariat. As Lucien Lerat has written, quote, "The work they do is of a particular skilled nature, and although their remuneration takes the form of salary or wages, the fact remains that their directing function in the economic process brings many of them close to the capitalist class. An extremely large section of this social category continues for the present to consider themselves above the proletariat." End quote. Long before the First World War, the condition of the old middle classes was growing constantly worse. As for the rapidly growing new middle classes, they painfully felt their economic dependence and saw with apprehension the day approaching when they would be reduced to the status of the wage earner pure and simple. The First World War accelerated both the pauperisation of the old middle classes and the proletarianisation of the new. The war was financed in great part by the holders of small savings. Monetary devaluation and the funding of government debt cut off the income of small investors. The little taxpayers were crushed by tax levies. The salaries of functionaries and office employees were not increased proportionately. The shrinkage in buying power of the masses diminished the business of the little merchants. The competition of monopoly capital remorselessly drove the small independent manufacturers to the wall. Technicians came more and more to feel themselves the slaves of the corporations that employed them. These symptoms, observable in all the post-war capitalist countries, appeared with particular violence in Italy and still more in Germany. In Italy, the fall of the lira between 1919 and 1920 cruelly squeezed the owners of fixed income. Their condition appeared all the more painful to the small investors, the holders of pensions, and those retired, because the proletariat had obtained, thanks to union action, a partial readjustment of its wages. At the same time, the economic crisis had driven many artisans and small merchants into bankruptcy. Industrial concentration, which had already whipped up, was going on faster than ever. As to the lot of the middle classes, Rousseau writes, quote, "Receiving incomes much lower than those of wage earners and forced to support much greater expenses, both for their living and their education, their life after the war became a daily torture. Too refined to adapt themselves to the narrow existence of the proletariat, too poor to bear the burden of continually increasing prices, they felt themselves caught in pincers that were slowly crushing them. Mistreated by governments whose least concern was to satisfy their needs, exploited by the newly rich who had built its fortunes on the ruins of their own, the middle classes felt they were losing every day a little of their rank and former superiority." End quote. In Germany, the fate of the German middle classes was still more tragic. While under the Empire they enjoyed, quote, "appreciable material security and moral prestige," end quote, the total collapse of the market bled them white. Those with fixed incomes and savings were reduced to the blackest misery. After the stabilisation of the mark, the public loans of the Reich, the states and the municipalities was revaluated at only about 12.5% of their original value. Law of April 1925. Quote, "Whole social strata of respected professions fell to the level of the proletariat, in spite of the desperate resistance by individuals to their fate." End quote. And this was written by Müller van den Broek. The salaries or fees of functionaries or office employees were reduced far more than the wages of workers in industry. A professor was paid less than a proletarian. After the inflation, 97% of the Germans were without capital. Then came the so-called rationalisation, which took the form of accentuated concentration and trustification. The middle classes suffered as consumers. They had to pay artificially raised prices for manufactured products. The little manufacturers and artisans were put out of business by the competition of the trusts and cartels, and the banks gave them credit only at exorbitant rates. The small merchants were hard hit by the increase in big stores and chain stores, and by the appearance of one-price stores. Big stores such as Tietz, Verheim and Karstadt embarked on an increasing number of activities: hairdressing parlours, bathing establishments, food shops, fish shops, butcher shops, tea rooms, restaurants, dressmaking shops, manufacturing and repair shops of all sorts. After 1925, the one-price stores multiplied in all the large and medium-sized towns. In 1931, 3 companies, one founded by Karstadt, another by Tietz, and the third by the American Woolworth Company, alone owned 250 shops. The one-price stores were very successful owing to the cheapness of their goods, made possible by the purchase of stocks at advantageous prices and by the rapid turnover of their capital. Technicians and members of the liberal professions came more and more to feel themselves the house servants of big capital. Reduced to the rank of intellectual labourers, they were nothing but, quote, a number in the factory. As for the small shareholders, they were increasingly swallowed up by the capitalist magnates. The creation of new preferred stocks with multiple voting power took from them all means of control and expression. They no longer had a voice and were forced to be content with the miserable dividends allotted to them. In 1929, the minister Stresemann cried out, quote, "If we go on this way much longer, we shall have nothing but the trusts on one side and millions of employees and workers on the other. The middle is today almost completely proletarianised." End quote. With the crisis of 1930, the third station of the cross began for the middle classes. They suffered more severely from it than did the proletariat, which was protected to a certain extent by union contracts and unemployment allowances. The situation of small commerce and industry became desperate. Office workers and technicians often saw their salaries sink lower than those of skilled workers. They were thrown into the street like authentic proletarians. Some of them were the sons of investors already ruined by the inflation. The old and the new middle classes were united in a common distress. As the stock market quotations continued to fall, the small fortunes rebuilt after the stabilisation of the mark were dissipated. In Italy, as in Germany, the sufferings of the middle classes drove them to revolt. The middle class is ordinarily of a peaceful temperament. As long as his economic situation is endurable, or he has hope that it can be improved, he is respectful of the established order and looks for the improvement of his condition through reforms. But when he must abandon all hope of improvement by legal and peaceful methods, when he perceives that the crisis from which he is suffering is not passing, but is a crisis of the whole social system, and one that can be resolved only by a radical transformation of this system, then he is easily enraged and ready to give himself over to the most extreme measures. But it is a known fact that the middle classes are prevented by their heterogeneity and their position between the two fundamental classes of society, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, from having a political policy of their own. Their revolt does not have an autonomous character. It can be exploited either by the bourgeoisie or the proletariat. Here we find ourselves faced with the crucial question: why do not the middle classes, ruined and despoiled by big capital, hold out their hands to the anti-capitalist class par excellence, the proletariat? Why do they not become socialist? We must first remember that between the middle classes and the organised working class there has long been a certain amount of antipathy and disagreement, which the bourgeoisie has not failed to maintain and aggravate cunningly to its advantage. 1. From the dawn of capitalism, the interests of the middle classes have been in sharpest conflict with the industrial and financial big bourgeoisie, and after the war the middle classes became frankly anti-capitalist. But their anti-capitalism was somewhat different from that of the proletariat. Proletarian socialism aims straight at the heart of capitalism. It wishes to destroy its motive force, the exploitation of labour power, and the theft of surplus value. Hence it attacks the capitalist system as a whole, and proposes as a goal the socialisation of the means of production. But the middle classes are not the victims of the exploitation of labour power, but chiefly of competition and the organisation of credit. Hence, when left to themselves, when their anti-capitalism is not given direction by proletarian socialism, they tend to have reactionary aspirations. They do not demand that capitalist development be pushed to its ultimate conclusion, the socialisation of the means of production. They want to roll back the wheel of history. They call for an economy that is not dynamic or progressive, but a routine economy. They want the state to regulate economic freedom and activity in order to restrict the competitive capacity of their rivals. They dream of a modified capitalism, freed from the abuses of concentration, credit and speculation. On the other hand, the technicians and office employees of the big industrial consortiums have anti-capitalist aspirations closer to those of the proletariat. Many wish, writes Harrison, for the nationalisation of those big enterprises that have not succeeded in winning their loyalty. They hope that as functionaries they would achieve material advantages, moral prestige and security. Their anti-capitalism is much more socialistic than that of the tradesman. While proletarian socialism is breaking the framework of private property, now grown too narrow, the middle classes cling to an archaic conception of property, and the capitalist bourgeoisie, while daily expropriating them without pity, poses before the middle classes as the defender of sacrosanct property and erects as a scarecrow socialism that denies property." End quote. 2. Furthermore, the middle classes are passionately attached to their class privileges, and after the First World War their increasing impoverishment only aggravated that attachment. The middle class has an invincible repugnance for the working class and the condition of the proletariat. In Mein Kampf, Hitler makes this characteristic confession, quote, "For people of modest situation who have once risen above that social level, it is unendurable to fall back into it even momentarily." End quote. The middle classes were not resigned to being proletarianised. The more their belief in their own social value is threatened, the more they attempt to consolidate their position. The most poverty-stricken functionary, the most debt-ridden shopkeeper, continues to consider himself a member of a class superior to the proletariat, even if he makes less than the majority of industrial workers. The white-collar proletarian, whose employer has imbued him with a false feeling of bourgeois respectability, is likewise hostile to the industrial workers. He envies them for earning more than he, and tries at the same time to differentiate himself from them by every means. He does not understand why proletarian socialism speaks of destroying classes. He trembles for his illusory class privileges, wishing to escape at any price from the proletarianisation that lies in wait for him. He has scarcely any sympathy for a socialist society, which according to him would complete his proletarianisation. He is ready, on the other hand, to listen to those who promise to save him from that fate, or, if it has already taken place, who promise to deproletarianise him. The capitalist bourgeoisie tries to align the middle classes against the organised proletariat. It utilises the fact that any wage increase obtained by union action raises costs for small enterprises more than those of big corporations, and that taxes necessary for the state's so-called social expenditures also have more effect on the costs of small producers than on those of the big companies. Finally, the capitalist bourgeoisie incites the small shopkeeper against the workers' cooperatives. This was particularly true in Italy and Germany, where socialist cooperatives reached a sizable growth after the First World War. 4. The idea of the class struggle, the basis of proletarian socialism, is at first not understood by the middle class. For him, unlike the worker, the capitalist exploiter remains anonymous, unperceived, hidden behind the curtain of free transactions. When he defends his threatened interests, he does it with the same mentality as the capitalist he opposes, one individual struggling against another individual. There is a conflict of interest, there is no class struggle. The position of the middle classes between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat explains why they tend to condemn all class struggle. That waged by the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, as well as that waged by the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. They are persuaded that class collaboration is possible, that there is a general interest above all antagonistic interests, and by general interest they mean their own interests, intermediate between those of the capitalist bourgeoisie and those of the proletariat. They dream of a so-called state above classes, which will not be in the service of either the proletariat or the bourgeoisie, and consequently will be in their own service. But while the proletariat proclaims the reality of the class struggle between capital and labour, the capitalist bourgeoisie carries on the class struggle behind the mask of class collaboration, and often succeeds in turning the middle classes away from socialism. 5. Another misunderstanding between the middle classes and the proletariat is found in the idea of the nation. While the worker, rootless and owning only the strength of his arm, has no fatherland, the middle class gives what he possesses the name of fatherland. To defend the fatherland is for him to defend his property, his workshop, his merchandise, his government bonds. But while the proletariat is inclined towards internationalism, the capitalist bourgeoisie, for whom money has no fatherland, decks itself out in the national mask and succeeds in duping the middle classes. Particularly after the First World War, the chauvinism of the middle classes was fanned, in Italy by the disappointments of the mutilated victory, and in Germany by the humiliation of defeat. The Italian and German middle classes were successfully persuaded that the principal cause of their misery was the unjust treaties, or the Diktat of Versailles. These good people came to hate not the capitalist system, which was really responsible for their wretchedness, or the representatives of this system in their own countries, but the international plutocracy. Anti-capitalism and chauvinism, national liberation and social liberation became confused in their minds. On the other hand, during this same period, the workers, tired of the war and full of enthusiasm for the Russian Revolution, rejected the gory idol of the fatherland and placed all their hope in the international. However, despite these misunderstandings and antipathies, so skillfully fostered and inflamed by the capitalist bourgeoisie, proletarian socialism in both Italy and Germany could have neutralised or even won over a large section of the suffering and rebellious middle classes. It could have done so not by disowning itself and making concessions that would render its programme unrecognisable. The middle class's hand is easily forced. Had the working class shown itself bold and determined to transform the social order from top to bottom and to show them a way out of their distress, they would have overcome their reluctance. But in both Italy and Germany, the working class parties did not want or did not know how to struggle against the existing system. In Italy, after the First World War, a rather large section of the battered middle classes placed their hope in socialism. In the 1919 election, the ballots of the middle classes were cast with those of the workers in greater numbers than ever before. When the metal workers occupied the factories in 1920, they had the sympathy of a great part of the middle class. But the Socialist Party showed itself absolutely incapable of leading the revolutionary upsurge of the masses. Instead of placing itself at their head, it dragged in their wake. In Mussolini's own words, it did not know how to, quote, profit from a revolutionary situation such as history does not repeat, end quote. In Germany, large layers of the middle classes voted for the social democracy in 1919 for the first time, while office workers and functionaries joined the unions. In 1923, at the time of the raw occupation and the monetary collapse, many ruined and desperate middle-class people came over to communism. But big capital was not defeated in Germany either in 1919 or 1923. In January 1919, the Social Democratic leaders crushed the Spartacist insurrection in blood. In October 1923, a new betrayal by the Social Democracy, to which was added the vacillating and zigzagging policy of the Communist International, paralysed the fighting spirit of the masses and led to another fiasco. Finally, after 1930, neither of the two parties claiming to be working class profited from the crisis of capitalism by destroying the system and conquering power. The working classes disappointed the middle classes by showing itself incapable of finding a way out of the crisis. In addition, it exasperated the middle classes by its day-to-day economic struggles, which were too fragmentary and timid to even maintain past gains, but which were quite sufficient to maintain a state of instability without curing any of the ills of society as a whole. So the middle classes did an about-face and blamed not only the trusts but also the workers for their economic stagnation. The organised right then only has to exploit this resentment against the workers, but the traditional middle class, such as the Nationalist Party in Italy or the German National Party in Germany, can hardly play this role since their avowed programme is preservation of the status quo. So the bourgeoisie changes its methods, it disguises itself and subsidises a political formation of a new kind, fascism. Fascism, far from declaring itself in the service of the existing order, claims to seek its overthrow. The better to dupe the middle classes, it professes to be anti-capitalist, even revolutionary. Thus, capitalism accomplishes the tour de force of channeling for its own benefit the revolt of the middle classes, which should have been directed against it, and of enrolling its own victims in organisations whose real aim is the defence of its privileges. Let us now consider the rural middle classes. Unlike the urban middle classes, they do not feel that they belong to a different class from the workers. Was not the worker himself a peasant yesterday, or the son of a peasant? The peasant is conscious of belonging, like the worker, to the people. But the capitalist bourgeoisie tries to arouse the peasant against the worker. It claims the proletarian socialist programme would socialise the land, and it makes the peasant tremble for his bit of soil. It utilises the fact that under the capitalist system, higher wages and industry bring increased living costs, and that governmental social expenditures call for higher taxes. Finally, the bourgeoisie seeks to convince the peasant that he and the big landowner have common interests. It utilises the conflict that exists under capitalism between the interests of agriculture and industry. Agriculture wants to be protected by higher tariffs and to sell its produce as dearly as possible. Industry is hostile, first, to the high prices of agricultural commodities, which increase living costs and consequently burden its own cost prices, and second, to an excessive protective tariff which would deprive it, as a result of reprisals, of its foreign markets. Hence, an attempt is made to persuade the peasant that as a farmer he has common interest with the big landowner to defend against industry. The peasant can then, according to circumstances, be drawn into either of the two blocks, that of all agriculturalists from the poor peasant to the great landed proprietor, or that of all the victims of capitalism from the poor peasant to the proletariat. If the socialist proletariat knows how to resolutely wage the struggle against the feudal landowner and the great capitalist monopolies, if it shows itself to be most dynamic, it can clear up all the misunderstandings and draw large masses of poor peasants behind it. If, on the contrary, the initiative comes from the big landed proprietors, if these show themselves to be the most audacious and appear to energetically defend the interests of the poor peasantry, they will draw into their wake the masses of small landowners. The latter is what happened in Italy and Germany. Fascism also recruits from two other social categories composed of individuals belonging to different classes but having certain economic interests and moral aspirations in common: the war veterans and the youth. The war veterans had in common certain material claims against the state, such as payment of war pensions, and this community of interest led them to organise. But there were other sentiments and memories that also helped to unite them: what has been called the comradeship of the front and the spirit of the trenches. Demobilised and back home after the war, they were prey to deep discontent. Many of them could not adapt themselves to civilian life. Even when they got back their former employment, they were weary, restless, disappointed. It was painful for them to return to the monotony of average existence, divided between work, the family, and a game of cards in the corner cafe. The most disorientated were those who could not find a job again, or because they had not completed their studies, lacked a profession. To them must be added the former commissioned and non-commissioned officers who were retired. 160,000 officers were put on the retired list in Italy in 1920, and many more in Germany. And finally, there were those who carried back from the war a physical need for violence, a need they could no longer satisfy in the prosaic existence of peace times. All were hostile to the existing order of things. They were irritated because the nation which they had defended at the cost of their blood did not give them the rank they expected. They felt a confused need for political and social regeneration. These aspirations might, in certain respects, have brought them closer to the organised proletariat and socialism. But between them and socialism there were a number of differences. The comradeship of the front, born of equality before death, was of a quite different nature from proletarian comradeship, and was unwilling to recognise the class struggle. The war veterans reproached socialism for insisting on the reality of the class struggle. Furthermore, the confused hatred the war veteran preserved for those behind the lines was two-edged. Almost socialist when its target was the war profiteer and the bourgeois politicians responsible for prolonging the great slaughter, but anti-socialist when its target was the militant workers labelled defeatist and pacifist. Nevertheless, socialism after the First World War could have guided the discontent of the war veterans. It was certainly impossible for it, without self-betrayal, to make concessions to the trench spirit and to give the fraternity of the front precedence over class solidarity. Nor could socialism, in order to pamper the war veterans, renounce its internationalism. But if it had displayed audacity, had it known how to link hatred of war and the war profiteer to the revolutionary idea, and had it shown itself determined to overthrow the capitalist system responsible for the great butchery and bring on that better human civilization for which so much blood had been shed, doubtless socialism could have attracted many war veterans. But it did not do so. It showed itself incapable of action. To these men eager for a new order, it appeared to be a superannuated and fossilised movement. It was fascism which offered satisfaction to the aspirations of the war veterans. Similarly, the youth have in common both a tragic material fate, unemployment, and an aspiration of a sentimental order, that youth should be considered an autonomous factor in society. In so-called normal times, the bourgeois youth and the young proletarian have little in common. The student of a bourgeois or middle-class family remains in the college or university classroom until he is fairly old, often well beyond his 20th year. During the long years of study, he is not integrated into the productive process, and he has no economic independence. For instead of supporting his family support him. He is considered not yet a productive citizen. Hence he has the illusion of belonging to a special category. He differentiates himself from adults and believes he has interest to defend against them. He talks a great deal about the aspirations of youth. In all periods, the common trait of this student youth has been impatience and envy. The young doctor, lawyer or artist must wait for many years before entering his chosen career. They form a union of malcontents against the elders who barred their road. Thus, in Italy around 1910, the intellectual and student youth was futurist with the poet Marinetti. These young people could differentiate themselves only by stressing their youth and inscribing the word youth on their banners. They knew only one thing, their impatience in the face of the future. Their bugbear was the adult, the man in office, the has-been. The oldest among us is not yet 30. Let us hasten to make everything over. We must go against the stream. Such was their leitmotif. In Germany, from 1900 to 1914, the intellectual and student youth was organised in the Jugendbewegung, youth movement, in order to assert in opposition to the, quote, mature in years, the autonomy and mission of youth. Very characteristic is the letter of invitation to the Congress of 1913 held on the Hohen Meißner near Kassel by 10,000 young people. Quote, for the older generations, youth has been up to the present only an accessory. It has been excluded from public life, reduced to the passive role of learning while mured away in stupid sociability. Now it is beginning to become conscious of itself and is striving to build its own life. Independently of the cowardly habits of its elders, it aspires to act as an autonomous factor in the social community. End quote. With the young worker, on the contrary, the idea of class is more important than the idea of age. As soon as he comes from the elementary school, there is nothing to distinguish the youth from the adult. On the job, young and old are subjected to the same exploitation. Often the young worker is the support of the family. He has passed without transition from childhood to maturity. He is already a man. But after the First World War, in both Italy and Germany, the lot of the young bourgeois, or petit bourgeois, and young proletarian was almost identical. All young people, without distinction, were victimised by the crisis. One, as a result of the economic crisis, the position of the intellectual and student youth became more precarious. Their particular aspirations were thereby intensified. In Italy, the demobilised youth, whose studies had been interrupted, as well as the new graduates, had the greatest difficulty in finding or getting back a position. Their families were severely affected by the monetary depreciation and the high cost of living. Furthermore, the war, which they had experienced either as soldiers or behind the lines, had given them a taste for adventure. Their quality of youth had been exalted. Quote, youth, youth, springtime of beauty, sang the Arditi in their hymn Giovinezza, which means youth, which was adopted by the fascists. Now they were idle, rudderless, eager for action. In Germany, the economic crisis, which began at the end of 1929, plunged young students and intellectuals into terrible distress. Their ruined families could no longer afford to pay for their studies, and they could not work with their hands. As for the graduates, they had no hope of finding positions. The candidates for government employment had to wait until they were 27 or even 30 years old, and only 20% of the applicants were examined. For 24,000 diplomas granted, there were 10,000 positions offered. These young people, demoralised and rebellious, hated a society that forbade them to use their talents and condemned them to inaction. Unemployment crushed the proletarian youth. Rootless and declassed, rejected by the productive process, the young unemployed was placed in an economic and moral position quite similar to that of the young student. The solidarity of age brought closer together all the youth reduced to idleness and despair. They rebelled against the injustice of their lot and demanded a social system under which youth would no longer be sacrificed. The phenomenon was especially striking in Germany, where in 1932, 26% of the unemployed were less than 24 years old. Large numbers of young proletarians had to abandon the family roof and wander through the streets and the highways without hope of finding work again, or without having ever worked. Uprooted, declassed, often delinquent, these young vagabonds no longer expected their salvation from the action and triumph of their class. They joined the army of unemployed young intellectuals. In Italy, and especially in Germany, socialism could have won over a great part of the desperate youth. It was obviously impossible for socialism, without self-betrayal, to take a stand on the fallacious ground of youth in itself, and to give the idea of age precedence over the idea of class. But it would have been sufficient for it to display strength and audacity. Youth naturally has a love for risk and sacrifice and a contempt for danger. The boldest, most idealistic movement, the one demanding the greatest sacrifice and showing itself the most capable of overturning the existing system which is responsible for their distress, would be the one to win them. If socialism had shown itself the most dynamic, it not only would have prevented the young workers from deserting their class, but it would have attracted a number of young intellectuals and students into the proletarian army. But the socialist movement did not show itself revolutionary and ceased to be a pole of attraction. It was fascism playing skillfully on the youth mystique which won over not only the intellectual youth, but also, what was far more serious, many declassed unemployed youth. Finally, fascism recruited a certain number of proletarians. Although it did not succeed in making an impression on the great masses of the proletariat, it did succeed in detaching from the working class certain categories of workers who, for various reasons, lacked class consciousness. In a period of crisis, a strong and daring working class vanguard gathers around it all the peripheral layers of the proletariat. But if the vanguard lacks energy and dynamic force, the class decomposes and falls apart. That is what happened in Italy and Germany. If you want to read more on this subject, then I recommend reading Fascism and Big Business by Daniel Guerin, which is available for free online on the Libcom website. I would also recommend reading Roger Griffin on this subject as well. Thank you for listening, everyone. All the best.